This is Andrea Gregg, and you're listening to Death Talk Canada. Here at Death Talk, we're going to be discussing everything death. As a funeral director and embalmer, I'm surrounded by death every day. We will be discussing loss, grief, trauma, dying, palliative care, the MAID program, and the funeral industry. This is for anyone who's ever suffered a loss, who lives with grief. My hope is to help you in some way by shining light on these difficult topics. Thank you for listening. Hello, Sarah. Welcome to Death Talk Canada.
Good morning, afternoon. It's beautiful today.
It is a beautiful day. And thank you so much for joining us. And I know you, of course, as Reverend Sarah Scott. Maybe you could introduce yourself and give a little bit of a bio.
Well, it's a funny thing, like when going through the grocery store, I see someone and I know them and they know me. And it's always a bit of a puzzle to figure out how we know each other because I wear a lot of different hats in a lot of different places. So overall, I am a pastor. So I was ordained 20 years ago, which is kind of hard to believe. And so a lot of people know me through a pastoral role. But in the last 10 years, I've been working in chaplaincy. And so that has a lot of different community points. So sometimes I'm filling in for a church, just in regular community clergy, but most of the time I'm working now in healthcare. So I did about 10 years working in long-term care, and then the last three in Valley Hospice for spiritual care clinician and also in the Inspired program as an advanced care planning facilitator, which basically means sitting down with people with very serious illness and figuring out what they want for their end of life care, like what their priorities are, what they want for like CPR or not CPR or where they want to spend their last days. So I work at Valley Hospice, Inspired in the community, and also for Valley Hospice Foundation as a grief specialist. And that's a very open-ended role, just looking at how to support grief care in the community. So through all of those different hats at the grocery store, I normally can figure out with someone uh, how I know them.
Wow. I didn't realize that you had worked that long in long-term care as well. Wow.
Yeah, I switched over when the babies were born. They were born back to back, and all of a sudden I realized pastoral care was going to be a bit challenging because like everything happens at 7 p.m. when babies have to go to bed. So I switched to chaplaincy partially for the convenience of it. And what I discovered was, as that sort of divine humor, that that type of ministry was actually my deepest calling, like to be able to meet with families in a very different setting. Like a church setting is a totally different environment than spiritual care alongside of somebody's end of life or illness or like the last years of their life. It's just a totally different perspective. And I found that whole community of care, like inspirational. So the last 10 years have been very, very stimulating. I enjoyed being a pastor, but this is really the perfect fit for me.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, people would need, that type of care more so while they're dying and been given a terminal diagnosis. I would think in any other facet of life, I mean, they would need that support, you know.
Yeah. And it really crosses all of the different economic backgrounds, personality types, like there's no one that death doesn't touch. So I really enjoyed encountering with people who wouldn't necessarily walk through the doors of a church, but to be able to have those deeper discussions about what gives your life meaning and purpose and what gives your life hope or forgiveness, like that is just a topic that goes across every person. So I found it like a door opening to have conversations with a diversity of people that I really found deeply meaningful.
And you may not see a lot of those people in their normal life coming to church or
Right.
coming
Yeah.
to, yeah, that's
Yeah.
interesting. I never really thought of that. Um, can you explain what the difference is between palliative care and hospice and what would sort of qualify somebody to come into hospice?
Yeah. So there's a huge shift in even using the word palliative care. Like back in the day, like even when I was starting in long-term care, like if somebody was palliative, that meant they were sort of in the last like sort of throes, like maybe the last week of their life. But nowadays, the use of the word palliative really is being pushed back to very much earlier in someone's disease progression. And the idea from it is that palliative care doesn't mean somebody is dying. Palliative care means that they are living alongside of a serious life condition, basically. So it's palliative. So you want to have good palliative care very early on because it's the focus on, okay, this might be, this is a very serious problem, whatever it is, a cancer, a tumor, a diagnosis of whatever it is. So how can we look at managing the symptoms, managing the disease progression in a way that gives life and functionality and comfort? So palliative care, because some people are saying they don't want palliative care because that means they're going to die. But palliative care really is like a gift of life in the middle of a very serious diagnosis. So for my role with advanced care planning, that's in that palliative care journey. That's saying, okay, you have a serious, for my job is lung condition, you have a serious lung condition. Let's talk. So that's to allow somebody to sort of put the plans in place to have a good thing. Hospice care comes a bit further, typically. I mean, everybody gets referred into things at different times. Hospice care is really focusing on that end of life stage. So in hospice care, the general understanding is that you have weeks to months to live. So, sort of like, and that's a very sort of vague term, weeks to months, but it's sort of looking at like really thinking of the last 3 months of a person's life expectancy. But as we all know, people are tricky little things to predict. So sometimes it just doesn't go that way. But that's what the understand. Hospice care is focusing on quality of life and at that end point of a disease. Hospice care can take place in a residential facility like the one I work at Valley Hospice or Halifax Hospice or Cape Breton Hospice. And that's like a separate facility that's just dedicated to that portion. But there's also hospice care throughout all of Nova Scotia. So hospice care can take place in the community. It can take place within a hospital, like perhaps they have a wing that's dedicated to specifically end of life care. And the whole philosophy is, in a nutshell, is to take the emergency factor out of dying. It's saying, like when you're in a hospital, dying is sort of like the enemy, like just, you're trying to do everything to avoid that. But in hospice, the idea is like, okay, if death isn't the enemy, if death is a friend and a known possibility, how do we make living with that friend more beautiful and helpful and healing and caring and actually very positive. So a lot of people, when they hear that I work at hospice, they say, oh, that must be so sad. Like, what a sad place to work. But actually, hospice is sad sometimes. I'm not going to downplay it, but it's also hilarious and beautiful and boisterous and ridiculous because that whole emphasis is on sort of love and connection in the midst. So it just takes all the emergency bells and
Yeah.
alarm bells down a notch to say, okay, how do we make this a healthful life experience?
Yeah, so people sort of that where death is imminent, it might be months or it might be days. And I'm sure that you see all gamuts. You probably see people that come in and they don't last a day, or you see people that might be there for months. I
It's
take it.
It's very difficult, and I've really appreciated, so not coming from a medical perspective, like, you know, um, none of my training was in medicine until the very last stages, like when we're looking at clinical pastoral care. But it was an eye opener to come to hospice to realize how difficult it is to say that predictive. And that's the number one thing people want to know is that how long, doc? How long do I've got? And it is the hardest question because people are so complicated. I often use the analogy of depression medication because a lot of people understand that, because a lot of people have gone through that. It's like, well, if you have this one diagnosis, you try this one and maybe it works and maybe, like because every body chemistry is different. The same with death, death and birth. you can have all of the signs, but really there is a divine mystery to how people's bodies respond. So yes, typically at hospice, we one of the admission things is too that it's not a place if you're actively dying to arrive at. Like the idea isn't to arrive there to die. Again, it's that weeks to months. So there's the expectation that you're going to have a bit of time because it's very stressful on a person to transfer them. Like it's very hard. Like it can be very disruptive. So the idea is if you're actively dying, you should stay wherever you are. Like if you're in the hospital, stay there. If you're in the home, to provide those supports to be able to stay where you are. But as you say, people come in and it's hard for healthcare workers too because you you're human and you get attached to people and you have expectations and so it's sometimes jarring. It's like I had a plan for today. Like we were going to do a thing. It was going to be
Yeah.
great and you were going to love it. And I had all of the supplies to do this thing and now you're gone. Um, so it is and then other people, you really grieve with the families on these long prolonged cases where you look at the person and you think you really think of those scriptural verses of, oh Lord, have you forgotten me? Like how long must this endure? Like without any, food, or the person hasn't had any water, and you think, how long can this person simply exist? And so that time of waiting in a sort of sacred space. So whenever people come into hospice, I always say to the families, always, I say, live each day the way you want to remember this day being lived. You know,
Absolutely.
with ease, with grace. If you want to bring in somebody, bring them in. If you want to do. So we've been celebrating Christmas at hospice, for the last couple of weeks. People have been like, let's just do Christmas today,
Yeah.
because you just don't know. It
No.
does. It's just a place of mystery sometimes, and how things go together. So a lot of working at hospice is releasing expectation. A lot of coming to hospice as patients and families is just a great exhale. People are typically very tired when they come into a hospice. Families are typically very tired. And so it's that um, allowing someone else to pick up the weight, but not knowing really what the measure of days will be.
And you must see people of all walks of life again, but people that might be afraid to die. You probably have people, I'm sure, that may have faith and are maybe even looking forward to it. Could you explain a little bit about what you see from one extreme to the other?
Yeah, faith is an interesting little component to this because you see people all across. There's the full spectrum. One part I would really encourage people who are interested, chaplains or pastors who are encouraged to go into this field because it gives never-ending variety. Because every person that walks through that door gives a certain different aspect to it. So faith is an interesting component because for some people, depending on what their faith history was, and depending on what their practice was, and depending on what they received, is a real is a real variable for what you see presented to you. So, for example, if a person is like a vessel and they've had poured into them all of their life, whole and comforting and full faith, care, that's what they have. But sometimes that's not the case. So with religiosity, I see the spectrum. I see some people who come in and because of their religious training and faith, like it gives them such an underpinning of strength and confidence and courage. It's amazing, and the stat like you can just see it a mile away. And on the other extreme, I've seen people come in with a religiosity that actually has been very traumatic. So what has been poured into them was actually very fearful, very judgmental, very condemning. And so the person sometimes is clinging to me because the message they received, whether that was truly what they were told or not, was God is a person who will condemn you. Um, and they'll say to me, I've tried. I have, like I really want, I've done all of these good things. I've, but underneath that underpinning is fear. So in those cases, my role is very different, for the different spectrum of religious care. What I would say overall is what's in you comes out at death. So if you have lived your whole life with gratitude and sort of those disciplines of being able to receive love and give love, being able to receive forgiveness and giving forgiveness in death, that comes with ease. And so if throughout your life that has been cut off, in death, there is a lot of fear and bitterness and anger and fury and brokenness, and that all comes out. So it is inspiring in a way for those of us who work alongside the dying to take account to our own lives. The idea that the work works. The disciplines that you take on now are actually what your skin you grow into. And also to um, families hope that in death, people will be um, what they hope people will be. And sometimes that's not true. They find out that mom, who was very condemning, look, there she is on her deathbed, condemning them once more. and and they'll come out of the room and say, I can't believe she said that to me. Like, how can that be the last thing? People die the same way they lived.
Wow.
And typically their energy is actually lower. So it's hard that. So for faith, I find it inspirational because you see the people who have cultivated what we talk about in Christianity of the gifts of the Spirit, and the fruit of the Spirit. So if they have cultivated those things in their life, like um, forgiveness and grace and compassion and gentleness and faithfulness, if they've cultivated that through the whole of their life, when they pass, it's like they just receive that in spades. And very much, even in that same book of Galatians, there's the analogy, like you reap what you sow. And that's very true in death care. You see that all of the time. Now, things surprising happen. That rule is not always true. Sometimes people have had very, very difficult lives. We have people who come into hospice as well who have experienced insecurity with food, insecurity with housing, insecurity with family relationships, very broken relationships, very fractured families. And all of a sudden, at the end, when they receive quite holistic care, they respond in very deep and powerful ways to making that switch from being very bitter to being very appreciative. So things can turn around, but overall, it's an interesting thing how faith plays into this. Faith also being connected to a community is incredible. How some faith communities, like when a person's at their end, that faith community just surrounds that person and gives such support. I can see a case I'm thinking of even right now where that faith community paid for the hospital bed in the home, and they paid, like they figured out meals and
Probably
support
have
for this
more
family.
visitors all the time,
Well,
even, I'm
more
sure.
visitors. Oh, some families, like we have to be like, okay, look, folks,
Yeah.
this person has to rest,
Yes.
Or some people say to me, like, they'll say, like patients will say, I can't, I don't know how to tell my family, please stop coming. Uh, so these faith communities can be such a support. But it's not always the case. It's depending on 'cause a lot of places are rural or smaller, and that support isn't there. But once again, it's an opportunity to live out your belief in care. So when it works, it's a beauty to behold, to see that spiritual care.
Absolutely. I find even as a funeral director, dealing with these families, I can see such a difference with people that have a strong faith and believe in something, whatever it is. And
Yeah.
like you said, the community support is such a difference with people that don't necessarily have that faith. And families come in and they're almost grateful. She lived a long, lovely life, and she's got so many friends and people that are going to turn up for this funeral. And then you see the opposite end where people, same as what you said, they're bitter, they're angry, they don't believe in anything, and there's really no hope. And I've picked that up, a lot in my career. And yeah, it opens your eyes as you get, for me, as I get older, because I've never really been close to my religion.
Mhm.
But I do find the older I get, the more that I am pondering that,
Yeah, yeah,
because I
yeah,
see what a difference it makes for
yeah.
people.
I think many of us in this generation too are reevaluating that, like what, because
Yes.
there was such a cultural shift over the last couple generations, and work has affected this, and two working parents, weekends there has been a disconnect from sort of church community. So I think our generation is really reevaluating what does that mean? Like, can we're getting a sense that we can't live in isolation, and especially people who have moved away from their community pockets, like what does spirituality, because everybody has spirituality.
Yes.
Spirituality, as I define it, is that sense of meaning, purpose, values. You can have healthy spirituality or unhealthy spirituality. So you can say, well, I have no meaning in life, and you still have spirituality. It's just a very unhealthy one. Um, so every person has that, and how they express that in um, and cultivate that through the many different tools that we have. But that connection to other people is so vital. And so how do you cultivate that in your life? How do you get that intergenerational connection too? That makes such a difference for the long-term support and the long-term support of your family, like those threads. I really feel for people who come into end of life and it's just the two of them. Do you know what I mean? It's like, and if they, you lose, and then you're kind of an island. So, how to develop these big threads of webs of support spiritually so that you're being supported through the whole of your life, however that's expressed. Um, Super important.
Do you have people with sort of bucket lists or maybe peace that they want to make with people? Do you have that? Do you see that?
Do you know what? It's funny. I was actually surprised that people are less like that than what I would have assumed in for hospice care.
Yeah.
Um, I find that people are surprised how much energy dying requires. So I think it's a little bit of a surprise to people how how low energy you can be in those last months, where the romantic ideas of what death is like in the movies of like I'm going to do like all of those things require even the desire to want to do them.
Yeah.
I think people aren't really prepared for. I find most people are actually quite baffled at their lack of interest. That's the part that I think surprises people. It's not that, oh, I want to have a ride in a helicopter, or I really want to see my grandchild, like those things that you just were pictured. What I find more often is people say, I used to love doing this and I have no interest. Like I used to love watching the birds and like we put out all the bird feeders and like all the thing on the thing, and they're just like, nah, or
Mm,
reading, they're just not in. So there's a natural process with dying of letting go. And part of it is that like attachment.
yeah.
Um, So there's a lot of talk about that, much more so in Buddhist tradition than Christian tradition, I find, of accepting detachment, like of it actually sort of leaning into that letting go of I no longer need to accomplish this. I no longer desire to finish this, or to see like um and being okay with that. I think that's surprising to people. And when they say, "Oh, mom always loved visitors, and now she really just wants to, be alone or privacy," there is a real switch, often in those last months that can be jarring for
Yeah,
families.
that's interesting. It's almost like like you said, a natural sort of detachment to what they were used to in life.
Yeah,
Almost like preparation. Like,
yeah,
yeah, that's
yeah. And
interesting.
like it doesn't matter. It's sort of like right now, if your home were to burn down, or you were knowing it was going to, like let's just like theoretically, you knew your everything you're going to lose everything that you had in your home. Like that'd be such a traumatic thing. But when you're at this sort of point of life, the idea of like things, you know, doesn't matter. Like like people's worlds become small, but sometimes that's an okay thing. Like it's just a like it doesn't matter. Like this doesn't. Now, for other people, that's not true. Anything you say about humans is not going to be true in their circumstance. I say that and instantly I draw to mind like the people who are so attached like to their homes, like having to leave their home. Do you know what I mean? Like there's
Yeah,
this spectrum no matter who you're talking about. But in general, I find that it's less of a bucket list environment as it is a sacred stillness
interesting.
that comes at that time.
But what a lesson for you to see every single day that time is limited, you know, leave your bags at the door and live life, and
Yeah,
stop, yeah, stop
yeah.
complaining.
And that all that you need very little in life, you know? Like
Yes.
I'll often look at, a room, like the mom is dying and the kids are around the bed, which doesn't always happen. Families are complicated. But in those moments where it works, like that's all your mom needs.
Yeah.
Like you don't need to, because sometimes there's an anxiety to do something, you
Yeah.
know, sometimes there's a real anxiety to feed people, because feeding people is life, right? Like that's what, like feeding people is life. So if someone's not eating, families get kind of stressed and they kind of push it where like eating at the end of life is actually quite painful or discomforting. And the same with drinking. Like there's just this natural like pulling back. And so to be able to counsel the families and just saying, just being is all your mom needs. All she needs is for you to
Yeah.
chill out,
And let
you
go
know?
of those expectations.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and just
Interesting. Yeah.
be with her. Um, So we talk about eating as being a recreational activity and not a and not
Necessity.
yeah, it's just oh you wanna have, you know, cream cheese with a spoon? Like great, enjoy it. Like whatever. It's 10 o'clock at night, sure, go for it. Um, Rather than like sort of this is your meal time
Yeah.
and
Um,
stressing.
I was going to say too, another thing that I've really noticed over the years being a funeral director is that every family that I meet with has a story. And it's gotten me to think that I swear at the very end, maybe sometimes people get to choose that final moment because it's like, oh, they waited until my brother got there and then he passed away right as soon as he showed up, or they seem to wait until that last person leaves and then they pass away. Do you think there's any truth to that?
Oh, there's total truth into it. Opposite is also true. So just like everyone, there's this spectrum. So like in birth, it's the same thing. Birth and death are very similar because the body reacts and responds to subtle cues. So when there is like fear in the room of birth, fear in the room of death are the enemy. So when there is that release, then transitions happen. So in birth, if there's that release of, oh, I've arrived at the hospital, or oh, my person has finally arrived, then that can sort of flow through because the body on a very subtle level releases. So it's the same with death. Sometimes the person arrives, the date comes, the thing happens, the words are said, and the body just on a very subtle spiritual level releases, and it's magical.
Mm.
I caution people with it though, because sometimes people who have sat bedside for very long periods of time, all of a sudden, because they've heard all of these stories, from other people, and then they get kind of angry because they're like, well, I told mom, I said, I told her the words. I said, Mom, it's okay for you to go. And she's just still
Hang on.
so like there's a balance and everything, right? So there is truth that sometimes when those words are spoken, the body releases and going. And sometimes, just like in birth, you do all the magical things. You drink the raspberry tea, you go for the bumpy hay wagon ride, like you do all the acupuncture, and still that baby won't be born. Like this time is sometimes the only thing that happens. Time will deliver that baby and will deliver that person. So, absolutely, does it happen? Yes, because the body is deeply spiritual. But it doesn't always happen because the body is very
That's right.
complicated.
That's right. So, with all of your work in long-term care and hospice, what are your major takeaways about life and spirituality? I know that's a huge, loaded question.
Do you know, once at a graveside, somebody asked me, the family said, oh, all we're looking for this graveside service is if you could do like a 2 to 5 minute sermon on the meaning of life. And I was just like, sure. Like, okay. Like, I'll just tell you. Like, here you go. Um, it's a beautiful question though, and I don't mind answering it at all. I found in my own life two major um, shifts happened. One was when I was in long-term care and I had my little girls in with me. I would often bring them along, partially because we were a busy family, and sometimes it was easier for childcare for me just to bring them along to the service than to leave them. I would have brought them along many times to funerals, and they always loved coming to funerals because they would find those candy jars in the back of, and they would just park like little mice in the back and eat all of the candies. Bringing them along to long-term care, I would talk with them and I would say, like, oh, look at these families. Do you, totally selfishly, I'd say, look at these sisters. They're taking care of their mother. Like,
Take note.
take note. Um, how I parent my kids has totally shifted. And like my own spiritual, like what gives me meaning and that sense of long-term community, giving them permission as well to grow as individuals because I see the fractures in families so clearly at end of life. You see how many families are broken. It's a lot. So if you find yourself in a broken family, know that you're probably normal. It's when families are totally cohesive, I say, hey, just so you know, this is weird.
Yeah.
Um, so raising my girls alongside of death the last 14 years is saying, okay, if I'm going to parent these guys long term, they need to know that they can grow as whole people. We can grow as connections. We can grow through our differences because we're all different personalities. But where do we find that deeper core of connection, that deeper core of uh, valuing in one another? So it has is absolutely affected my relationships with my family for the long term and developing those webs of different gifts for different times of life. Different people will serve in different ways. Also, now with living in hospice, because long-term care, you really saw natural deaths where people were dying at the natural time of life. Like these were sort of typically seniors who are, 80, 90 years old. Hospice ain't that way.
Mhm.
Hospice, you see much more complicated cases of very um, tricky cancers and tumors and diseases that are very cruel. So it's not abnormal for people to be there in their 50s, 40s, 30s. Um, and what that teaches me is that this is the only one and precious life we have. How I treat my body and how I treat the people around me is today. Uh, is today. And if you don't treat your body and treat your community well, any moment could switch for you where you need to depend in a very powerful way on other people. In some ways, that's kind of screwy in your mind because like in some ways that's not totally healthy to live in that way because like you're just waiting at all times for like peril to enter your life. Um, any strange bump or
What
any
is
strange
that?
symptoms,
Yeah.
I'm just like maybe this is a blah, blah, blah.
It
Um,
can bring a little bit of that up, though.
it does. It
Yes.
totally does. It
Yes.
changes your insurance policies, that's for sure. But it changes how you perceive life.
Yes, it does.
So if practicing gratitude, um, finding that spark of play and beauty, living the life you want to have now, because sometimes like you see these cases at the end of life and you think, good grief, surely this is not, you know. Um, so it has profoundly affected me and how I see the world, how I engage with myself, and how the decisions that I make on um, those big questions of life, and encouraging other people as well. Also, I would also like to say here in this platform, especially, that when dealing with people with end of life, you often discover that they have had very difficult dealings with death in the past. So it often people aren't grieving the person in the bed, you know, they're grieving the death that happened 20 years ago, or the miscarriage that happened, or stillborn deaths, or like often like people who are like in their 80s, like that's what they're talking to me about when they're dying is deaths that happened earlier in their lives and the trauma that they caused, or families because they're approaching this death carrying a traumatic memory of a very bad experience before. So I would find it important here to encourage your listening population to consider what grief has already played out in their life. And because grief doesn't go away, it does something to you. And it's either healthy, encouraging you to like go deeper into the beauty of the world, or it can also kind of fester and cause a lot of brokenness. So I would encourage everybody that idea of think of death as something that you might want to talk through. So if you haven't had a painful, traumatic experience with anything, talk through it. Start processing it now, like um, alcohol abuse, sexual abuse, adoptions, abortion, all of the heavy stuff in life. Um, Talk through it because the work works. Processing grief and trauma, you can move through it. So I would encourage every person to like go deeper into what some of those resources of care are for those historic griefs. Because when you're going through it is not the time to prepare for it. Again,
Right.
to use the analogy for birth, like the worst time to give lessons on birth is like in the labor and delivery room, right? Like that's a
Exactly.
terrible time to be like, ow, so physiologically, like this. So when you're grieving, it's the hardest time to take in like information or read a book, because your brain you have grief brain, like everything is just, and you're reacting from your amygdala and you're just like lashing out at people. So I would encourage everyone who's listening, if you are in a place where the sun is shining and your life is like, that's the time to open up a book and talk about grief of like parent loss or sibling loss or things like that. So
That's a great point because like you said, if you don't deal with things in life, it's still going to be there
Oh, it's
when
still gonna be there. You can just, yeah, it
oh,
is, what's in you comes out.
that's right.
But the work works. And that's the best thing I've learned at hospice. When you see people who have done therapy, who have done community, like restoration or done those forgiveness journeys, AA is an incredible program. Like when you actually see how people have taken their alcohol addiction and gone through those steps of making connections and forgiveness within their family groups, it's astonishing what people will accomplish in their life. So, but the time to do that ain't when you're dying.
Yeah.
That's a very tricky thing to do. That's a gamble.
Yeah. I just can't get over the importance of what you're doing for hospice and for everybody that comes in. I mean, that's just huge. And I hope at the end of the day, you know how important that is for people. And
Oh, we do. It is beautiful. And which is why when people say, "Oh, what a sad place to work," it's like, what are you talking about?
yeah,
Because you actually get to see what you're offering of compassion. Like that is such a powerful, like it's such a powerful gift to people. Like just not even doing anything. Like
yeah,
it's like so it's astonishing how just being kind and welcoming and gracious, what how much our communities need that.
absolutely. And I find people like you and I that deal with death all the time in a weird way. We do learn to appreciate
Yeah.
life, you know, and I always say I don't sweat the small stuff like I used to. You know, and I that old adage, like I leave my bags at the door when I go to work because I know whoever I'm dealing with that day is having a lot worse day than I am. And
Yes.
the big picture is that it's not my time yet. You know,
Yeah.
it's yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
wow. I can't thank you enough, Sarah, for everything you've done and everything you continue to do for hospice. I know that you're a great support for families and for people, and I think what you do is amazing.
It's my pleasure. And I agree, like this continuity of compassion throughout all of these touch points of wherever you meet people, whether it like whatever your job is, you meet people and you can cultivate community compassion. And so I appreciate that what you do as well and starting these conversations early and often.